Whenever Alireza Firouzja plays Hikaru Nakamura, it's an exciting game, but even more so when Firouzja plays a Benko Gambit and Nakamura accepts it, and that's when you really get a lot of action. This is the FTX Crypto Cup preliminaries from 2021, 15 minutes each side, 10-second increment. Nakamura has the white pieces, Firouzja has the black pieces. Let's jump right in. D4, knight f6, c4, c5, d5, b5. Firouzja offers the Benko Gambit. Nakamura takes it, and then a6. And a lot more people would probably play the Benko Gambit if white played what Nakamura plays, which is pawn takes pawn. Of course, it's a perfectly good move, but most people, or many people, will decline the gambit, play b6 or something of that nature. And those are fine for black, but it's just not as much fun. And Nakamura takes the pawn, g6, knight to c3, bishop g7, g3. And if you're unfamiliar with the Benko Gambit, black's idea is to play on the A and B files, assisted by this bishop at g7. And it's a pawn sacrifice for positional pressure, not a direct attack on the opponent's king. But it's easy to play for black and not so easy to play for white. And basically, what white's going to try to do, what Nakamura is going to try to do, is to neutralize the pressure on the queen side and then break through in the center with the push e5. Castles, instead of g3, e4 is another main line. Castles, knight f3, queen to a5, putting pressure on this c3 knight. You'll notice Firouzja has not yet taken the pawn at a6. He's delaying that capture. He might want to, he's not sure what he wants to take that pawn with yet. Bishop to d2, d6. And if you look at black's pawn structure, it is an absolutely beautiful structure. Just a fantastic structure. The only problem is, of course, he's down a pawn. He's actually down 2 pawns at the moment, but obviously he's going to regain the a6 pawn and be down 1 pawn. Bishop g2, knight b to d7. Firouzja continues to delay the capture of the pawn. He wants to put pressure on the d5 square and maybe use the c4 square as a location for the knight. Castles, knight to b6, putting pressure on d5, continuing to delay the capture of the a6 pawn. Queen to c2. This pawn cannot be taken, obviously, because knight takes and the queen would be under threat. Queen c2, and now Firouzja plays queen takes a6. He doesn't want to take with the bishop just yet. He wants to maybe do something else with that piece. One of the key ideas for black is to get activity along this a6 f1 diagonal. But at the moment, with this pawn on e2, there's not as much activity down that line, so he doesn't want to put the bishop there just yet. Queen takes a6, e4. Now, this diagonal is open, and perhaps he can find some activity down that diagonal. Knight to c4, hitting the b2 pawn. It can't be captured yet, but putting pressure on it, and threatening to take the bishop at d2, which would give black the 2 bishops and give him an unopposed dark squared bishop. b3. And this is the game's novelty according to my database, but a better option, according to the computers, might be something like a4, followed by knight takes d2, and then rook b8. If you look at this formation, the structure white wants to have ideally is a pawn on a4 and b3. The a1 rook is either at a3 or b1, and then the knight on b5. That's like the strong structure white wants. But to create that structure, white has to play with great precision. The slightest move order mistake, and the structure will collapse. But Nakamura plays b3, knight takes d2, knight takes d2, and now the dark squared bishop has no opponent, so Nakamura is going to have to constantly worry about Firouzja's g7 bishop becoming active. But the knight on d2 aims for the nice c4 square, which is a nice square for a knight. Knight to g4, wants to hop into e5, where it can put pressure on these squares. Often d3 is a nice landing place for a knight if black can keep that square under control. a4. The better move here probably, again, is probably knight to c4. But Nakamura plays a4, trying to create that ideal structure we were just talking about with pawns on a4 and b3 and the knight at b5. The problem is that the timing is just off. You have to really play accurately to make that work. And now the advantage goes to Firouzja. He begins by playing queen to a5, immediately putting pressure on the knight at c3. The rook comes in to defend the knight, and now bishop to a6. Now the bishop does end up on that strong a6 f1 diagonal. The bishop at g2 is not in a good position to contest that file. So in this position, if Nakamura, say, moves the rook to e1, then Firouzja can just play bishop to d4, and he's going to be finished. The game is essentially over. f2 will fall, and Firouzja would just win. If knight to c4, then bishop takes, pawn takes, queen c3, and after exchanges, black can go to work on white's weak c4 pawn, while the knight is a nicer piece than the bishop in that particular position. So seeing those bad options, Nakamura decides to play knight to b5, giving up a pawn. Pawn takes, bishop takes, pawn takes, and I think he's putting his hopes in the opposite colored bishops, that maybe he can pull a draw out if he can create an opposite colored bishops ending queen takes b5. But the truth is now, Alireza Firouzja with the black pieces is much better. He has all the normal advantages you get with playing the Benko Gambit, but he's not even down a pawn anymore, and there's this weak b3 pawn that he can put some pressure on. So Firouzja is in very good shape. h3, knight to e5, rook f to d1. Again, he has to keep that d3 square sufficiently defended. The knight could jump in. Rook to a3, pressuring the b3 pawn. Now bishop to f1, hitting the queen and getting a defense over that d3 square. Queen to b4, queen to c3. And Firouzja does not want to exchange queens here. That's for sure. Queen to b7. He doesn't want an endgame with opposite colored bishops. And by the way, this little trick does not work. He can't play knight to f3 check, revealing the bishop on the queen, because the queen can just take the knight, and he actually just lose a piece then. So queen to b7, queen to e3, rook to a2. Firouzja is going to use his heavy pieces and work his way in to Nakamura's position, deep into his position. Bishop e2, rook to b8, again targeting b3. Now Nakamura plays a strange move. He plays the move king to f1. The reason he plays this is he wants to play f4 to kick this knight out of e5. And if he does that immediately, he would lose because of this move, knight to g4, hitting the queen. And if pawn takes knight, or the bishop, either one, then bishop d4. The queen is pinned, and Firouzja wins. And any other move also loses material. Say queen to d3, check, king g2, then knight f2 would fork. And there are other forks in the position. It would just lose material. So he has to play king to f1 to set up f4. Firouzja says, don't bother, I'll move the knight already. I'm going to move it to b6, maybe put some pressure on the position. Knight to f3, queen to b4, bishop c4, doubling on the open a file. Queen to d3, rook to b2, continuing to work his way in. Knight to b6, hitting c4 is also a decent option. Rook a to a2, takes. So Nakamura has at least gotten one pair of rooks off of the board, but it's not enough. Rook to e1, rook to a2. Now he plays bishop to b5. He wants to force Firouzja to play this knight to a square where it will get exchanged off, and hopefully the opposite colored bishops will become enhanced. Firouzja plays knight e5, knight takes, bishop takes. So now we have opposite colored bishops. But, I mean, we've had them, but we know there is a tendency for opposite colored bishops to be drawish in the endgame, but in the middle game, the side with the initiative wants opposite colored bishops, because that means that they can attack squares that the other opponent's bishop cannot defend, and this is one of those positions. The opposite colored bishops actually favor Firouzja in this position. Rook e2, rook a1 check, king g2, queen a3, still worming his way in. Queen c2, rook c1, queen a2, queen to b4, bishop c4, queen c3, rook e3, queen to d4, just getting his heavy pieces deeper in the position. Bishop f1, king to g7, getting it off the back rank for any checks. Queen to e2, queen to a1. Now Firouzja has finally got his heavy pieces to the 8th rank. Queen to a6, offering another trade, avoiding it. Queen e2, rook to c2. Now he's got him on the 7th rank. Queen f3, queen to a1, bishop to d3, now rook to c1. He's threatening to bring that rook into h1 with mate threats to follow. King to h2 is probably the best move. So the queen, along with the king, could control that h1 square and keep the rook out of it, but it probably doesn't matter at this point. Rook to e2, rook h1. With a threat of queen to g1 mate, queen f1 mate is also threatened for that matter. Queen to e3, queen to f1 check, king f3, queen to h3. And here, Firouzja is threading a really, really cool mating pattern. Watch this. Let's say Nakamura just plays a nothing move. Let's say he plays bishop c4. This is Firouzja's threat. Queen to h5 check. King g2, and watch this move. Rook to f1, threatening queen h1 mate. Devastating, and he can't take the rook, because after he takes the rook, queen to h1 would be mate. That is the threat that Firouzja has on the board. So Nakamura strives to prevent that. He plays queen to g5, but rook to d1 hits the bishop. Rook to e3 defends it. But in this position, even though Nakamura just made the move, he resigned here. And the reason he resigned is because it is mate in 4. And here's the pattern. Queen to h1 check. If he plays king to g4, then just h5 check, which would force queen takes pawn, queen takes queen mate. So he has to play king to e2, and then this brilliant move would follow, bishop to c3, with a threat of rook to e1 mate or rook to d2 mate, and it simply cannot be stopped. After a spike check, mate would immediately follow. So really an impressive game. Makes me want to play the Benko Gambit, to be perfectly honest with you. Really a well-played game by Firouzja against a top player, a fellow candidate now, Hikaru Nakamura. I hope you enjoyed the game. Thank you for joining us at Chess Dog. See you again soon. Bye.